Why don't we see more Surge Engines? I want to see more Surge Engines.
Well, if this event goes well for the Simic Artifacts decks, you'll see more of it get to come. Thanks to longer standard, it is legal for another year.
That's true. All right, let's go down to the action. We are actually going to be watching from the perspective of Max, who is on Boros Convoke. And I think there's a little bit of a mulligan there, looking at a 6. This one's really nice. So 3 1-drops, Reinforcements, Evangelist, and the Knight Errant of Eos. Arya, 1 lander. Are you just slamming it?
I think it's pretty close, but 1 land is just so hard to keep unless you have like a Gleeful Demolition or something for 1 mana that really gives you enough board presence to make up for being stuck on lands for a turn. So I like Max's decision to mulligan there.
All right, and Max is on the play, so it does tend to make keeping the 1 lander a little bit scarier. This 5, though, is looking quite nice too. Warden of the Inner Sky, Case of the Gateway Express, and Imidane's Recruiter. Probably the most terrifying card in Standard right now.
Yeah, it's a scary one to be sure. This is, I think, a good example of the fail case of Boros, unfortunately, with a hand like this. So Boros is very much a critical mass aggro deck where you're looking to amass a certain amount of creatures and then use stuff like Case of the Gateway Express and Imidane's Recruiter to really turn all those little creatures into very tangible threats. So once you start mulliganing, once you're down creatures, it gets a lot harder to get to the amount of cards you require for amount of creatures, amount of board presence you require for the deck to take over the game with Recruiter, Case, and things like that.
Yeah, speaking of board presence, Turtle Boy Calvin getting off to a fantastic start there. Teething Wormlet on 1 with the Gingerbrute follow-up and the removal spell as well to take care of the Warden. And it looks like Calvin's going to be the aggressor in the early parts of this game. But look at this, Gleeful Demolition on that clue token, and all of a sudden, Max's board is just full of these goblins.
Yeah, I touched on Gleeful Demolition as a card Max would be looking for in the opening hand, and this really highlights why that's the case. The deck is, like I said, really a critical mass deck, and Gleeful Demolition is really, really important to the deck for specifically that reason, where it's 1 card that's giving you 3 creatures. So it really helps the deck make up for mulligans like this, or just surge ahead on board presence in a way that nothing else in Standard can really do. And the deck is very much built around that interaction.
All right, and you see Max that kind of thinking about it, did decide to chump with 1 of the goblins, still leaves back the 3 creatures to attack with to enable that Case of the Gateway Express to be solved. But meanwhile, Calvin has the Gingerbrute, it has the Zoetic Glyph on it. It's going to keep coming in for a chunk of damage as we see the boat come down. Is that another demolition?
Yeah, and this is one of the places we see the advantage of Gleeful Demolition versus the previous version of the previous version of this, which there's a reference to an older card from, I believe, Scars of Mirrodin block. And Gleeful Demolition being able to hit opposing artifacts is actually really, really relevant here, because making it a removal spell for your opponent's best threats, even when you don't have a target for it on your side, just ups the use cases of that card so much. It was already the strongest card in the deck, and this really makes it shine.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, yeah, there's value on the other side of the battlefield as well. Sentinel of oh god, what is this guy called? Sentinel of the Nameless City, coming down from the Discover of the Zoetic Glyph. The boat is coming in. I mean, Calvin's still really in the dominating position. I think that mulligan hurting Max here quite a bit, Arya.
Yeah, it's really hard for the Convoke deck to just cobble together enough resources on mulligans like we talked about. It's just like, once you get into a spot like this, once you're behind, the deck plays really badly from behind, because all of its cards are just like individual small creatures or things that make attacking easier. So something like an Imidane's Recruiter, for example, is not going to be very strong in a spot like this.
Right, and Max is down to 5 life, which, I mean, it is the aggro mirror, so the life totals matter a lot. As we see, Knight Errant of Eos comes down. Max is going to need a lot of help here. Let's see what they can find. It's just a Voldaren Epicure, but at least they can play that right now.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I believe this might just be lethal because there's a ginger brute in Calvin's graveyard, and with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, that can make the entire team unblockable, except by creatures with haste, which should be enough to get in for the win here.
Oh, wow. Agatha's Soul Cauldron just messing things up everywhere. In all circumstances, Search Engine couldn't be blocked anyway. And you're going to see Simic Cookies take down game number 1 in this blisteringly fast aggro mirror as you turn to the sideboard. Aria, what do you like here?
I like Destroy Evil pretty good against things like Sentinel of the Nameless City and Zoetic Glyph. Just having an out to those things, just having a cheap answer to the larger threats that the Simic Cookies deck puts into play is pretty important for Max. Part of what the Simic Cookies deck is doing is it's, again, spewing all these pieces of material onto the board and converting that into a few oversized creatures. So having answers to some of those creatures having answers to some of those creatures means the cookie stack is often going to be left with just a bunch of useless material lying around. And that's the angle on which Max most wants to attack. They want to be able to prevent those pieces of material from being turned into tangible board presence. And if you can interact with things like Sentinel and Zoetic Glyph, then you're a good few steps of the way there.
All right, we're going to see game number 2 now. Max is going to be on the play. And let's have a look at the opening hand. Hopefully this one will treat them a little bit better than the previous one. 4 lands this time, 3 creatures. I mean, Pakal, pretty important in this Boros deck. And that's going to be straight up a keep Calvin on 1, go into the Warden. And this one's looking quite nice.
Yeah. In an ideal world, Max would have something to play on turn 2. That's the only issue with his hand, but aside from that, it's pretty perfect. Sanguine Evangelist is a pretty good threat for this matchup in particular, where it's generating a bunch of bodies, but can also chump block the larger creatures out of the Simic Cookies deck. So it's hard to imagine being a hand that's better that doesn't have a 2-drop in it. I have to imagine Max is pretty happy with how this game plan is shaking it.
All right, and let's see what Calvin has going on. There is Spyglass Siren that's coming down, makes the map token, plus a tap lands. A little bit of a slower start here for Calvin than in the previous game, but here we're going to start seeing Anim Pakal, the 1000th moon, come down. And of course, when she comes down, if you attack with 1 or more non-gnome creatures, she's going to get a +1/+1 counter, and then you're going to make some gnomes. So this card can get really out of hand very quickly, Aria.
Yeah, and it might not have seemed that like much, but that Spyglass Siren on turn 2 was actually quite possibly the turning point of this game. Without that, if Max hadn't been able to attack and get unimpactful triggers, then possibly there'd have been some trouble, maybe a little bit on the back foot and unable to really get their engines going. But with the way that turned out, being able to get a counter and get some gnomes and put Calvin on the back foot, I think this is a really, really good spot for Max. And I think Calvin's going to have a hard time keeping up with the amount of value and board presence this Boros Convoke deck is generating.
So, Aria, when you're kind of playing this Boros Convoke deck, there are a lot of different things you can do, right? Like you can tap your creatures for the Warden, you can tap them for the Knight, etc. How do you prioritize that if you're a Max seat?
Well, I think in this spot, you really just want to be building board presence. Like you're ahead on that axis, so you really want to press your advantage while you have it. So it makes a lot of sense to me to go for something like the Knight Errant rather than tapping Warden, which is going to just put more bodies into the battlefield and dig you towards something like an Evidence Recruiter. That's almost certainly going to win the game if it resolves next turn.
Yeah, Everyday's Recruiter, 2 copies in hand for Max. I mean, even if you don't get to cast the 5 mana side, just the 3 mana side is terrifying enough. Plus, there's another battle cry effect, I believe, on the battlefield as well. And all Calvin can do is add a Sentinel of the Nameless City to the battlefield. No attacks, staying back on blocks at Aria. Surely this is enough.
Oh, this is way more than enough. I believe this would probably kill Calvin even if they'd taken no damage this game, and they've certainly taken some damage already.
Yeah, that is for sure. Calvin, 13 life facing down. a multitude of creatures plus a bunch of pump effects. And yeah, I'm going to throw some blocks in front, but it is going to be Max with Boros Convoke, evening things up here in round number 4 at the Birds of Paradise standard 1K. And we're going to see a decider between these aggro decks. Any differences on play and draw here for Max? Oh, it looks like the answer's no.
Well, not in the sideboard, but there's definitely going to be differences in the game plan for post-board games where you're a lot less reliably able to get out ahead and start swinging like Max was that game, just because it's an aggro mirror. Whoever's on the play kind of has the ball in their court, can start being aggressive earlier in the game. And so we might see the game pan out pretty differently from Max unless there's a particularly explosive start where they play a more mid-rangey game, maybe try and chump block a little and go wide, rather than just trying to go as fast as possible and play as much to the board to kill Calvin before they can really get the engine set up.
All right, game number 3, the decider here between these two players. I believe they are both at 2 and 1 today, so we're doing pretty well as we get into round number 4. There's another one landed here for Max. Oh, and that's a tough one.
Yeah, I think if this Gavin had been something that could cost like lethal demolition, I would have considered it in Max's spot, just because demolition is that strong, but without a way to cost it.
From 1 lander to 0 lander, so Max down to 5 yet again. And that is, the issue is that these Convoke decks are very low curve to the ground, not playing that many lands, 22 lands in this particular list. So you're going to run into these problems every so often, but this one is looking all right. Voldaren Epicure coming down, Knight of Iron of Eos ready, and War Leader's Call. That's a pretty exciting one out of this Boros deck.
Yeah, I think in this spot, this hand maybe doesn't look the most exciting, doesn't have much to do on turn 2, and Call's not great on turn 3, but it's one thing that generates multiple creatures away from being a really, really good hand. Specifically, this deck really wants some way for that to turn that Knight Errant on, so ideally like a Gleeful Demolition off the top. Something like that could leave Max in pretty great shape. Despite a seemingly lackluster start by being really explosive. But until that happens, they're definitely on the back foot.
Meanwhile, on the other side, by the way, it's Christmas for Hayu, otherwise known as Surge Engine on 2. And it's going to be joined by Teething Wormlet plus Ginger Brute. So that Teething Wormlet's going to start getting those counters, getting bigger, and these creatures coming in. It just, every time we watch these kind of low curve aggro mirrors, the play draw dynamic just seems to be so crazy.
Yeah, though something like Gleeful Demolition, that can do a lot to switch that up. That adds a lot of presence to the board very quickly.
You see Max thinking about, well, should I play this Warrior's Call first and then get my triggers? But it decides to just go for it, get the 1/1s down, get the Knight Errant down, perhaps, or maybe even deal with that one of the threats on the other side right now. But I love this, Aria. Get that Knight Errant down and start looking for more gas, and that's gas.
Yeah, and talked about it before, we'll talk about it again. This is what makes Demolition so strong. It's just kind of does everything the deck wants to do. It generates board presence from not much. It's functionally a ritual. It let Max cast a Knight Errant that they would not have been able to before, and really ties a lot of what this deck's looking to do together.
All right, but it's not like the Simic deck has no way of dealing with it. Hard-hitting questions took out that 4/4 Knight. Calvin was able to get in for a little bit more damage. Max on the back foot, life totals wise, down to 11, and now let's see what Calvin is able to put together, because this deck has quite a lot of tricks up its sleeve. Tough Cookie, the namesake of the deck, is down on the battlefield, and Calvin's going to go exploring a little bit first with these map tokens.
Yeah, and this is really that play draw disparity you were talking about, where sure, like on the On the play, this would have looked actually pretty good for Max. They could have applied a bunch of pressure and maybe turned those Gleeful Demolition tokens into some early attacks with Unimpakal, Nimadin's Recruiter. But on the draw, they're just so far behind on board that like generating a bunch of tokens is just not going to cut it against this artifact deck, and this and puts them pretty far behind.
Right, that Surge Engine, just you can't block that very up. That it can just be extremely difficult. Oh, and that's actually just going to become a lethal threat with the Explorer finding a non-land off the top, and it's going to be Calvin with Simic Cookies taking down this round 4 match against Boros Convoke. A little bit unfortunate there for Mike. Did have to mulligan a couple of times, but the Simic Cookies deck putting on a show for us.
Yeah, it really goes to show that not one of your conventional decks, not the most like known. It's no Esper mid range or 5-color legends, but I mean the deck's a real deck, and this is yet another thing I like about larger standard. That sure, there's the most well known 5 decks, but if you look at the 10th, 15th most played deck, that deck's still a real player and can do well against lists that are unprepared for it in a metagame that is unprepared for it. So really impressive showing by that deck.
Yeah, all right. So that was a pretty quick one. And I think we are going to be able to bring you some backup magic from round number 4, because I think we spent a grand total of like 10 minutes or something on that match, which is pretty fast in these arena standard events. I hope all of you enjoyed the fireworks there from the Simic artifacts deck. Let's see what we have coming up for you. I believe it is going to be, we are kind of putting our feet on the brakes just a little bit in terms of speed. We have a nice grinding up Demir mid-range against Azorius Control, I believe. So let's have a look at where we are in this one. Oh, my apologies. We are jumping to 5-color legends in the hands of Dylan. So a little bit of Slowgike action going up against that Power Stones. No, not at the Power Stones. Going up against this, I'm going to call it white artifacts, question mark. Okay, all right. Yeah, and it seems like Sophie has like gone off, as we're joining this particular game. Those artifacts are absolutely massive. I think they were are they constructs? I think that were basically created by the Thousand Moon Smithy, flipped. Ah, all right. Okay, so I mean, this just looks insane. There's just so much happening here. All of those constructs are absolutely massive. Actually, Ari, I think there are 2 flavors of construct going on. But I think I do also see the flipped Thousand Moon Smithy, which I think is a gnome and not a construct, but it's essentially a construct. And let's see what Dylan can do here. Now, there's a lot of tools, right? For the 5-color Legends deck, Otawara seems pretty good against these tokens. Okay. Yeah, I think this one is definitely going to be wrapped up here. But that was just, I think, game 2 going to Sophie. I think I see a little game one win indicated there for Dylan. So we're going to be looking at the sideboard, and that's a pretty quick pass back. Wasn't quite able to catch what Dylan had changed up from the main deck. But of course, if you are interested, I think you can go on the Melee page and look at these deck lists in full. Oh, this hand for Dylan, Honest Rusty plus 6 lands. If you do want to see all those lands, but you probably don't want to see that many, is going to keep this 6 though for Dylan. Duress, Relic, and a whole bunch of lands, Aria. Right, and Dylan following up with that Relic of Legends as well. Meanwhile, though, Sophie has the Simulacrum down. It's 2 copies, I believe, of Saheeli in hand. And is that Saheeli? Hmm. Right, and this list, like, I mean, it's interesting. The 5 color Legends list, obviously, it's gone through a lot of changes in its time, as we see a second Simulacrum synthesizer come down for Sophie, and that is going to get out of hand pretty quickly. So this list definitely running a copy of Javrina, Dauntless General. That's coming in out of the sideboard for Dylan. Javrina, when she comes in, exiles a graveyard, or you can sacrifice it to give humans Hexproof and Indestructible. So a little kind of bit play here. What do you think the reason was for Dylan bringing that in? Yeah, and now look at this. Dylan gets to pass the turn back, has no lands untapped, but 4 mana available thanks to the Relic of Legends. And that's going to let her use this Visaggio and at least try and take out one of these synthesizers before they can both start generating more and more tokens. World Waker's Helm, World Waker Helm, no, World Walker Helm. Oh my goodness, Aria, coming in for Sophie now, and this one is saying if you're going to make an artifact token, you get a map as well, and then you can copy tokens. So this deck is just all the blue eye artifacts plus some of these. I think they were from Big Score, I'm gonna say. Uh, Special cards coming in, and Sophie getting in with a 5. All right, so we're gonna see another token come down. Rona is gonna do some looting, And this is kind of where we're going to start seeing Slowgut go off. Has the third counter on it, so at any time Dylan can activate the ability, remove counters, bring Slowgut back to hand, and start getting those lands out of the graveyard again. Takanuma is going to go digging, find Jarina. That's a nice interaction area. Yeah, it's nice to see it go off and kind of do its thing. You know, this deck, super, super cool, very difficult to play. Like, you have to really, I think, train yourself to play because you have to do a lot of counterintuitive things. You know, the timing is very interesting for a lot of these things, very difficult, very easy to kind of mess up some of these sequences. But you can see Dylan extremely well practiced with it, knows exactly what she's doing. Mm. Right. I mean, at some point, you know, Slogurk itself can get big enough to just kind of kill you in a few turns. If, you know, there's no combo hill, there's certainly some plan Bs available for this deck. Yeah, I mean, look at this. There's only 3 lands on the battlefield. That Relic of Legends is just doing so much. And, you know, thinking back all the way to turn number 2, when Dylan waited, used the duress, took out the No More Lies, and if Sophie had been able to have access to that No More Lies for the Relic, we would be seeing a very different game. Right. Elastial Core now has been found for Dylan. Please, Aria, I can tell you're champing at the bit to go. Yeah, go ahead.
Because it's tapping with Relic of Legends. So if you have, say, 1 mana legends like Inti or Moronas, that's generating additional mana. Every time you cast one of those, you're going up 1 mana. Every time you channel one of the channel lands, you're going down 1 mana. So you channel a channel land, either Takanuma to get a 2-drop back from your graveyard, or an Ottawa to get you a 2-drop back from play. And so essentially what you're doing is you're spending 3 channel lands and playing 3 creatures, and the creatures are all putting you up a mana, and the channel lands are all putting you down a mana. Then once you've done that, you put 3 counters on your Slogek in play. So you return your Slogek in play to your hand and then replay the Slogek. The Slogek costs you 2 mana because Old Rotstein's giving you a discount, but it gives you 2 mana back. So you get, because you're getting 1 mana off the Slogek itself tapping and 1 mana off the Rona tapping. So that's mana neutral again there. So, and every time you channel the Slogek, every time you play the Slogek, you get to get back those same 3 channel lands that you were spending before to loop your legends. So this is a loop that does nothing. You take a lot of game actions and you play a lot of cards, and it costs 0 mana, but doesn't leave you up any resource. Except every time you do this, if one of the lands you're channeling is a Takanuma, you're digging more cards. So you're putting more cards into your graveyard that you can recur on future turns. And if you have an Inti, you're exiling cards when you channel lands. So you're getting more cards in exile that you can play. At some point, you find your 1 copy of LSL Core, which we see in Dylan's hand. And then once you have that, every time you have this loop and you're channeling Takanuma, you're generating dice triggers because you're legend ruling your 2 mana legends to get new ones into play and generate mana. And LSL Core deals your opponent damage every time one of your things dies. So that just about always kills your opponent because it's an infinite combo, infinite death triggers, and eventually they lose all their life.
Wow. I mean, I do feel like you kind of need a postgraduate diploma to understand this deck, but frankly, I think that's incredible. Like, it's just amazing that this kind of deck can exist in standard, right? Like, this is more kind of something that you would think about in EDH or in some of the older formats. You can see these really crazy loop decks, but the fact that this is possible to make happen in standard is just incredible. And we're going to see Sophie say, okay, well, I have to use this depopulate, try and force some of these creatures of the battlefield and set you back a little bit, but it's really just feels like, Dylan says it's just great for Dylan to have Slogok back in hand.
Oh, and I want to draw your attention to something, which is Dylan is just drawn the second infinite combo in this deck.
There's another one?
Wait for it, there's another one. And this one's much simpler. You need 2 copies of Honest Rotstein. Honest Rotstein generates costs 2 mana, generates 2 mana. And on ETB, gets back another copy of Honest Rotstein. And you just loop those for infinite death triggers with Ellis in play, and that just wins the game.
Okay, well, that one is a little bit simpler. I feel like that one, you only like high school level diploma. You're happy with understanding. Yeah, I mean, great to see 5-color Legends do its thing. It's just one of the coolest decks maybe ever made. Super, super nice to see it, and especially in the hands of someone who's obviously played it a lot. Although Aria on Arena, that's a lot of clicks. Like it's a lot of actions to take.
It's a pretty time-intensive combo on Arena, and so pretty hard to execute, but I think doable, particularly if a skilled player like Dylan has a lot of experience with this deck, has done a lot of the looping. Like, once you get those actions down, you understand the play patterns, you understand what the loops are, you can go through this really fast, and really impressive to see someone like Dylan pull it off, even on a client where it's quite difficult.